Hi, I'm Mike Jacobs with Generals International, and we're wanting to invite you in studio here with us with some very special guests who really love this nation. And we have David Barton. David, it's good to have you here with us, Mike. With Wall Builders. And then we have Mark Herr and Michelle Perkins with the Center for Self-Governance out of Tennessee. And this is going to be very, very important for you. We believe that believers should be engaged and steward government, and I believe that your lives really are engaged in that yourself. So, David, tell us a little about Wall Builders, why you do what you do. There's many things you can be doing, and many things you have done, but why do you do what you do, and tell them what you do.
What we do, Wall Builders is taken from the Bible book of Nehemiah.
Okay.
In the Bible book of Nehemiah, you have a country that had been great, has now gone downhill. Nehemiah gets the people together and said, let's rebuild. We don't need to be a reproach anymore. We can turn this around. It is the largest grassroots effort that happens in the Bible. Everybody got involved and did something, and when they did what they all thought was impossible, when it started, they all said, Nehemiah, we can't do this. And quite frankly, had I been in their position, I probably would have agreed, because taking stones that weigh 100 tons and raising them 70 feet in the air, I would have said, no way. Wow. And Nehemiah says, look, if we'll all do our part, we can get this. And so 52 days later, what they all thought was impossible was done. So less than 2 months later. That's grassroots. That's what happens if we engage. Usually we talk ourselves out of engagement. We have reasons why we can't. I can't make a difference. I'm not good enough. Those are professionals. I'm an amateur. There's all sorts of reasons. But what's cool is when everybody did a part, it all turned around. And so that's Wall Builders. We do a lot with what would be called education and mobilization. Okay. Try to equip people to know, and with Christians is particularly, why should we even be involved with political things? That's the first. Yeah,
let's talk about that for a minute, because there's got to be some kind of biblical perspective for that as a believer.
Let me hit that real quick. Let's just get that out of the way, because before people turn this off and say, well, I don't care about politics, I'm a Christian, let's take care of that right now. If you care about the Bible and what the Bible says, then you know that in Genesis, God establishes 3 institutions. The first is the family, Genesis 1 through 3. Then in Genesis 9, he establishes civil government. Then in Genesis 15 on, he establishes the church, or the vertical relationship. So government is the second institution established. Now, I was recently with a group of about 500 pastors, and I asked them, I said, give me verses that you know where the Bible specifically addresses civil government. I got 7 or 8 verses. Wow. This little book right here, this is the book, signer of the Declaration, Richard Henry Lee, said they, quote, copied the Declaration from this book. Wow. This book was originally written in 1690. This is the 1774 version that was used in America. They copied the Declaration from this book, and if you'd gone to American public schools 50 years ago, you would have read this book, because this is the origin of our government. Now, the problem with this is we don't read it today. And you can see it's not real thick, it's thick, 400 pages. Why don't we read it? Because it cites over 1,500 Bible verses to show the proper operation of civil government. So on the one hand, you get pastors come up with 7 or 8 Bible verses. Well, here's a book with 1,500 of them. Wow. You know, most people didn't know there are 1,500 verses in the Bible, much less on government. So the Bible absolutely unequivocally addresses government. You go into Hebrews 11, our Faith Hall of Fame. Everyone God lists as our heroes from verses 22 to 34 were involved in civil government. Why would he hold them up as heroes if we shouldn't be involved? You go over to Luke 19. Jesus goes to the story of the minas, and he says, what'd you do with the investment? The guy says, well, I hid it. This guy said I made 5. This guy said I made 10. Notice the reward. He says, well done, good and faithful servant. I'll make you a ruler over 10 cities. Well done, good and faithful servant. I'll make you a ruler over 5. When did getting put in civil government become a reward? Well, it used to be. And that's the way Jesus viewed it. We don't anymore. We reject that. You have 1 Timothy 2, where we're told to pray first of all for leaders and those in authority. Yeah. Now, why did God put that number 1 on the prayer list? Before you pray for your family, your job, your income, your church, your ministry, you pray for government and those in authority. And the problem with doing that is, if you look at everything else the Bible tells us to pray for, we're told to pray for workers in harvest. We're told to pray for unity, John 7. When you start praying for it, you start working for it. If I start praying for unity, I'm going to look for ways to make unity. If I pray for workers in the harvest, I'm going to find people. If I start praying for civil government, I'm going to get involved with it, because I can't just pray about it. I got to do something with it. And so
that's talking about more than just voting.
That's more than just registering to vote. That's more than just voting. Now, voting is the absolute minimum. John Adams, other founding fathers made it really clear that someday we will stand before God and we will account to Him. The Bible tells us that, but it kind of goes like this. I gave you your life. What'd you do with that? We'll account for it. I gave you your family. What'd you do with that? We'll have to account for that. I gave you your possessions. What'd you do with that? We'll have to account for it. I gave you your country. What'd you do with that? Oh, Lord decided not to get involved in that. That was secular stuff. I don't do say. No, we'll have to answer to God, because at the least He gave us a vote, but He also gave us a voice. He also gave us a constitution under which we can get involved. And I don't mean this to be a monologue, but let me just jump in to finish this biblical analysis. We're told in 1 Timothy, we're told in Peter, we're told in Jude, we're told in Romans, all over, the civil government is ordained by God. It's an institution of God. So here we are in America. Our question is, what kind of civil government do we have? Right. Well, it's a self-government. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a self-government. You look at Luke 19:13, essentially Jesus says, you guys take care of that government until I come back. I'm giving it to you. It's yours. You take care of it. When I come back, however it turns out, it's your call. I mean, it's in your hands. Mm-hmm. And so for us to voluntarily choose not to be involved in a charge that He gave us is denying the efficacy of the Scripture. It's denying the instructions He gave us. It's denying common sense. I mean, I don't know how far we want to go in apologetics, but that's enough to say there's a biblical basis for Christians not just voting, but for being actively involved, engaged citizens, informed citizens, participating citizens.
Well, now, when he talked about government, he wasn't talking about, when he talked about civil government, he wasn't talking about a theocracy, which is what many people today fear. Other than...
Let's put an end to that. What is a theocracy? A theocracy is a government that God runs. As long as you have elections, you'll never have a theocracy. Mm-hmm. So the notion that if Christians get in power or Christians get involved, it's going to be a theocracy, that is stupidity. Yeah. Because as long as the people are choosing their own leaders at every level, you cannot have a government where God comes in and imposes. And so this far left stuff that says, oh, for Christians to get involved, they're trying to make a theocracy. No, we're choosing our leaders. And by the way, we're told in Exodus 18:21, choose out from among you the leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, thousands. Have elections. Have local, county, state, federal elections. You do that, you're not going to have a theocracy. So just put that nonsense out of our mind. That's a ploy that wackos on the left and secularists and progressives try to use to keep us intimidated, to make us ashamed of our faith or our values. Don't do it. As long as you're having elections, there is no possibility of a theocracy.
Well, I want to bring Mark and Michelle into this at this point, because one of the things that you talk about in the Center for Self-Governance is language, and that words have meaning, and our founders had intent when they used the words they used, but that there's a warfare over words that we're encountering today.
Yes.
And I want you to address that, but first tell them a little about why you are doing what you're doing. I mean, there are many things you could be doing, but you're not. You're doing what you do as it relates to serving people who need to get engaged in government. Mm-hmm. So tell us why you're doing what you're doing. Let's talk a little about this whole issue of words and how words are being corrupted and meanings are being corrupted.
Absolutely. I came at this from a perspective of a mother and a wife, and I wasn't deep in any aspect. I was up to here in a little bit of everything. I wasn't walking a faithful life per se. I was doing the mom thing in the suburbs and helping my husband's business develop. And what I realized is there was unbelievable anger coming up in my life watching my husband's career path. And what that anger stemmed from was overreaching government and overreaching taxation. And I knew in my heart there has to be some way citizens can do something. So through a very strange path in my church, I sat down and was hit in the head with the sin of sloth and how heavy of a burden that is on Christians. And that led me out of what was my sloth state. I was not being active. I was taking everything in that society puts on us and sitting there with it, overwhelmed. And that started the path of literally exercising my spirit and my soul. And it came to a point where I could bring together Michelle's politics, Michelle's faith, my outreach to fellow citizens. It became the perfect petri dish. I truly believe what our God and our founders impressed upon us and gave us. And when those things all work together, your personal life, your moral life, your religious life, and your political life, which we typically don't casserole together in America. We've been politically told, political correctness, I can't have that conversation with you anymore across the dinner table. I turned that upside down. And that led to where we can have these discussions and debate and grow. Citizens stopped growing. And now I can pass that. It's the love letters to the children. If we can do this, it will be a passage through 1891. They still had it. You were talking about old textbooks. This one in 1891, it was still all there. So the love letters to the children. I'm a mom.
Well, okay, now, Mark, tell them a little about yourself. And then how in the world did you guys get connected? You're not married. You know, you're each...
Everyone thinks we're married. We're not married.
Well, it's because you're having to teach together all the time. And
we are. We're brother, sister at this point.
Good. Well, we clarified that. So, Mark, share a little.
So for me, it was growing up in a military family that traveled all over the world. And so I was in many different cultures, many different Christian backgrounds, from Presbyterian, Baptist to Methodist, Mennonite, all kinds of experiences. And we just didn't talk about politics that much. My father was military, so he was very busy with that. I was running around the streets of Korea, playing soccer, shooting fireworks, having a good time, but not really paying attention to the country, like David was pointing out earlier. And when I hit 38 to 40, I'm 44 now, I started to have this realization. I have abdicated, my conscience was abdicating or becoming numb to what my role is as a citizen in this thing called a gift of a country. And so I began to ask a lot of questions, just a lot of questions. What is my role? How do I participate? What is my impact? How much impact do I have? And I've discovered I had wasted 38 years, and now I'm trying to make up for that time when I should have been engaged at the very youngest of possible ages through education, through participation at the minimum level of voting, and then even beyond that is in relationship to my community and what is my role in the community in driving the discussion. Having a discussion with my neighbor about our neighborhood. It is so abnormal today, but it seems so normal from reading the history of how often they connected with each other. They were constantly in a conversation, a discussion about the community and the direction it should take. And this word that David used, self-government, became very much on my radar screen about 2010. And we started to explore this. I met her in the legislature of Tennessee along with two other colleagues. So would you like to sit down and have a conversation about self-governance? What does it mean? How do you do it? What does it look like? Can we explore it? Can we experiment? And based on our experimentation, asking so many questions. That's why I love this country, is because it opens the door to experimentation. We can ask the question. We can have the conversation, not be dragged off to prison. We can sit in here and have a practical conversation about how do we keep our republic.
Well, didn't the founders even consider what they were doing to be a grand experiment of some kind?
Some, but they also had a certain set of fixed principles. It was an experiment because it had not before been done in the history of mankind the way they did it. But it was already fixed in that they used principle. I mean, if you take the first 155 words in the Declaration of Independence, it set forth 6 principles. Those principles, they said, were rock solid because they came out of the Bible. They were simple principles. So having found a government to implement them, now that was something new. That was an experiment. But the principles weren't new. And so they relied on fixed principles that produced fixed results. And going back to what Michelle and Mark both said, I want to throw one other thought in here. This is a book done by signer of the Declaration, Benjamin Rush. And John Adams said he's one of the 3 most notable founding fathers. He signed the Declaration, ratified the Constitution. He was in 3 presidential administrations, the director of the U.S. Mint, you name it. But he's also known as the father of public schools under the Constitution. Because in 1787, when he did the Constitution, we ratified in 1788, 89. We start the federal government in 1789. He's an educator. He started 5 universities, 3 of them still go today, started female academic education. He's a pioneer in education. But he did this piece to say, all right, now that here we are in 1789, in this modern era, we now have a nation. And in this nation we have what kind of education does it take if we're going to remain a nation? Because we've been 13 different nations. I mean, all of us, we call them states, they really were nations. 13 different nations, but now that we're one, what kind of education is it going to take to keep us all together as a nation? And so that's where he writes this piece, and in it, it's really interesting. He says, the duty of public schools is to teach three things. He says the first thing is public schools are to teach young people to love and serve God. He said the second duty of public schools is to teach young people to love and serve their country. He said the third duty of public schools is to teach young people to love and serve their family. Now notice the order. God, country, family. I would just about lay you odds at 99.99999% of Christians today would say, no. It's God, family, and country. We would put family above country. They put country above family. Now, why would they do that? Is it because they didn't know the Bible, they didn't love their family? No, they love their family, but they pointed out, Benjamin Rush pointed out, he said, if you ever lose control of your country, it will become the great enemy of the family. If you want to preserve your family, you got to keep control of your country. And so we taught the country, and if you look at where we are today, everything we call the culture war comes from policies the government has passed because we've lost control of our country. Nearly every policy they passed is directly contradictory to the values that we see in polling for the nation, but we haven't been participating. We haven't been involved. We didn't want to run for office. I hate people in office. I'm not going to run for... Man, the people that don't want to run for office are the best people to have in office because they're not there for greed or money. They'll serve when they get there. Yeah. And that's why George Washington, John Adams, these guys, every chance they got, they retired and went home, but people kept reelecting them.
I remember, David, you said in the past that one of the criteria was not wanting to serve in public service. In fact, if you ran for public office, like, you're kidding, we'll never support this guy.
Well, Sam Adams, another early educator, one of the top three educators, Noah Webster, Sam Adams, Noah Webster, so many others said, anyone who puts himself forward for office immediately should be disqualified.
Wow.
And that was, and it goes back to a parable in Judges 9, a great parable in Judges 9. The trees of the field got together, said, we need civil government, we want a civil leader, we're going to go choose our leaders. And it said they went first to the olive tree because the olive tree was so productive and said, be our leader. And the olive tree said, no, I'm too busy being productive. I got too much olive oil. And so they went next to the fig tree and said, you're a productive tree, you be our leader. And the fig tree said, no, my figs are way too sweet, making too much here with the fig. And so they went to the vine and said, vine, be our leader. And the vine said, no, don't you realize my grapes produce wine that cheers the hearts of both God and man. And so they went to all the good trees, and all the good trees said, no, I don't want to do it. And then it said next they went to the thorn bush and said to the thorn bush, come be our ruler. And he says, happy to.
Yeah.
I love you. What we
don't have anything else I'm doing.
Nothing. What we have thorn bushes ruling today. And that's because all the good people say, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to get involved. I don't want, boy, that's corrupt. Well, it's corrupt because all the good people got out of it. And so this concept of God first, country second, and then if you take care of your country, you will have taken care of your family. You will have given them a good place to be. And see, that's where what Michelle, that's what Christians have got to get. Michelle got it. It's that. Hey,
but it had to come through revelation almost. That wasn't something that you just opened a book and it popped out at you.
Actually, I've been educated as we launched in Texas, which is an incredible story in itself. I mean, this is a notebook and a pen in fall of 2011 and 4 citizens. We didn't know what experiment we were doing either. Yeah. We didn't. This has to be downloaded from a greater source. I mean, he's smart, but come on. This is a quilt of the old, and we've meshed it with the new. Mm-hmm. I am not an expert in anything except what I was focusing on in my world, which was my husband and my children. Mm-hmm. So how can I help him in any way? That day when he stopped me in the legislature, I came from the Tea Party, the grassroots movement. Yeah, I figured out enough. I was mad enough to exercise some of that fury out of my mouth, but was it doing anything? No, that's actually not true. It told me that I could do that. Yeah. I was doing something I had done never before, walking to the legislature and saying, let me tell you something, mister. I have an opinion. So I was expressing my opinion, but it stopped right there. The milestones that we had envisioned in our head that were just going to fall in our laps. I've got my rights. I've got this Constitution. It wasn't working out that way. And the day Mark said, let's have a chat, my other partner who I'd been working with, the question was very simple. At this point in time, we're playing by the rules set up in modern day, not historical. Yeah. That's important. We were playing with the current rules as told. Are we getting anywhere? Our unanimous answer was no.
That's right.
So he takes it from there. He says, well, then what do we do?
Yeah.
We answered the question, what do we do? And then the obvious question with that is, how? 3 little letters and a punctuation. That how is a monstrous task. How is all there, but how do we bring it up to today's generation?
Mm-hmm.
You, scholar. But is that going to translate to mom in the suburbs changing diapers? We have to move the information in real time.
Mm-hmm.
And we have figured out how. It's not easy.
Yeah.
That's the downside. The proof is there, though, that it works. Yeah. Since 2011 to 2014, we call them our glory stories. And we've had 3 or 4 come through this morning from all across the country. And there's your fuel.
Mm-hmm.
That's what propels us, and the wheels have started to turn now. Yeah. That's why we're on this couch.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah, it's interesting
it doesn't make sense.
that both of you have with you today in studio some, what people would say, oh, those are older books, you know.
Yes.
But they're older books of principles.
Absolutely.
That if, and we talked about this a bit, if I were in any geographic area and needed to establish a country, to establish a nation, just as our founders went back to principles, age-old principles, to rely on to establish government, we could do that today. In fact, what we're trying to do is go back to or restore back to what some people who were really wise understood.
Let me hit part of what you said, too, because there is a tendency, one of the things that subverts people and pulls them away from principles is, oh my gosh, that Constitution's 200 years old. Yeah. They didn't have internet back then. Yeah. The fastest form of transportation they had was horses. They don't know anything about where we are today. Mm-hmm. And that's appealing in a sense. But you see, the problem is, let me go back for a bit even further. I've been involved in 7 cases of the U.S. Supreme Court. And a bunch of the cases we dealt with in lower courts were 10 Commandments cases. Because it used to be in America, it's easier to find the 10 Commandments in a courtroom than a church house.
Yeah.
And that's because they form the basis of civil government. Now, you look at the 10 Commandments, and as the secular stuff started happening 20 years ago, and the courts, especially on the 10 Commandments, they said, oh, no longer can you have a 10 Commandments in your courthouse. You know, if you would put up other legal codes, put up other things that influenced America, put up the Code of Hammurabi, put up the Code of Justinian, then you can have the 10 Commandments. And every time a judge told us that, I knew that they didn't have a clue what they were talking about. Because number one, the Code of Justinian says, in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, we enact the following. And so, I mean, the 10 Commandments are Jewish, they're Judeo-Christian, they're Old Testament. This is New Testament, Justinian. And then they get to the Code of Hammurabi. And the Code of Hammurabi, wait a minute. You wanted codes that influenced America? Now, it's true, the Code of Hammurabi was written 300 years before the 10 Commandments. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't discovered until 1906. So tell me how it influenced America if we didn't even know it existed.
1906.
And then when you read the code, here's what's really funny. The code, 730 some odd laws, I think it is, and it says, you know, if you accuse your wife of adultery, she has to go jump in the river. And if she drowns, then she was guilty of adultery. But if she doesn't drown, and it goes to, and if somebody takes your cow, then you have to go to, everything was so stinking specific, none of it applied to today. But that's where the Constitution is so cool. It doesn't give you specifics. Yeah. It gives you principles. And see, with me, I used to be a school principal, math and science guy. You and I are both pilots. Mm-hmm. The reason we fly planes is because 500 years ago, we figured out what the Newton's laws of motion were. And if it wasn't for Newton's 3 laws of motion, we couldn't fly. I'm a scuba diver. Well, that goes to Boyle's law of gases. Yeah. And all these things I do today are based on 500-year-old principles that don't change.
Yeah.
And if you don't get the principle,
you know, they didn't know we were pilots.
Yeah, we are.
Or scuba divers.
If you don't get the principles right, the principles are timeless. And that's the deal with what we have in government is So many academics say, oh, it's so old, it's 200 years old. No. They didn't give specifics. They gave principles. Yeah. And those principles work just as much as the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of gravity, anything else. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing Christians have to be careful for, because they hear all these pundits on TV and talking heads talking about, it's an old, outdated system, and it's just not where we are today. And no, the principles are timeless. Mm. They work.
Go ahead, Mark.
What did Thomas Jefferson mean in his inaugural address when he said, "But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle"?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing that they had, because they did agree on certain fixed principles. And Jefferson came to office at a time where that there was absolute hatred between parties. I mean, the hatred between those two political parties make Republicans and Democrats today look like a bunch of babies. They were really serious hatred. And so he comes into office with a divided nation that has gone through but as divided as they were, and even in George Washington's cabinet, he had a divided cabinet. He had Federalists and Anti-Federalists, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and they're the two guys that had the vicious campaign. Right. They both served under him. And it's really interesting that you find identical statements from both parties on certain fixed principles. One fixed principle was the fundamental principle of the Constitution requires that the will of the majority shall prevail. Well, that was a fixed principle nobody was willing to cross. I mean, nobody was going to go past that. It was a fundamental principle that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. Right. Neither side is going to take on religion and morality. As much as we hate each other, we will not damage the foundation. And so they had this thing, differences of opinions, but they had principles that were fixed that both sides agreed on. And that's how we came out of that presidential election with Jefferson without having a revolution. I mean, if it had been France or anywhere else, we would have had a revolution. But the principles were so embedded in the people that they understood that. And that's, I think, one of the key things that we've gotten away from today. And I'll just throw some things out. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are phenomenal documents. I mean, we've got 237 years under them. So under that, we've become the most prosperous nation in the world, the most creative nation in the world, the most stable nation in the world. And other nations thought, we'll just copy that. And so if you look between 1797 and 1800, there were 15 nations in Europe that copied our Constitution Declaration. None of them lasted more than 4 years. Then you look from 1800 on, and all across South America and Central America, dozens of nations copied our Constitution Declaration. None of them survived. You look at Liberia. Liberia copied the Constitution. Even our economics, they used the U.S. dollar for their exchange. Didn't survive. How come? The words are all right, because they didn't have the principles. What happened was the Americans had a certain set of principles in their heart. And because they did, and because the citizenry was educated in certain principles, didn't matter who got in office, the principles guided. We're getting to the point now where we know those principles less, and therefore it's easier to move us in different directions that we've never moved before, into things we've never done. I mean, quite frankly, right now, we have never in the history of 400 years of the United States had the attacks on religious conscience that we have right now. We've never had the attacks on the right to keep and bear arms that we have right now, because we understood that those were God-given principles that came out of the Bible. I don't care what party you're from. God's the one who said these, so we never fought about them. Now we fight about them because we don't know what God said. We don't know what the principles are. And in the case of the Declaration, they started, hey, we believe there's a creator. Government believes that. We believe the creator gives certain guaranteed rights that government can't touch. We believe there are certain fixed morals, there are rights and wrongs, the laws of nature, nature's God, that nobody can alter. We believe that government exists to protect our inalienable rights. We believe that below inalienable rights in the moral law, we run it by the consent of the governed. And we believe that if the government didn't do those first 5 things, we can change our government. Right. Those were 6 principles that everybody agreed on. And nobody from any party, and we've had dozens of parties in America's political history, nobody was willing to take on those 6 principles and deny them. And that's why you go back to Jefferson, hey, we got lots of differences of opinion, but those principles.
Wow. When did the principles start to change into this debate over opinions?
The principles started to change as a couple things happened, and it literally goes back to the hands of we, the religious people in America, the Bible-believing people. we went to an epoch in about 1879 where the church really split, denomination split. And at that point in time, we had about half the church that said, you know what, I don't know about this politics and government and science and law, and I don't care about that. People need to know Jesus. I'm going to get them saved. And so they became the evangelicals. The other remained the fundamentalists. The Bible's fundamental. We've now taken about half the Christians out of the process. Then we go through three major political setbacks in the 19-teens and 1920s. And starting in about 1925 and 30, you'll find in writings that churches start saying, kids, you want to do something good for God? Be a pastor. Be a missionary. Stay out of secular stuff. Don't get in journalism. Don't get in law. Don't get in entertainment. Don't get in media. Don't get in government. And so suddenly, and there's really, I look at 5 major cultural centers in any nation that directs what that nation will be. Sometimes they're called the 7 mountains. Other people call them 7. Whatever they are, you got business, you got education, you got government, you got media, you got pulpit. Those 5 things, if you lose control of them, those 5 things will determine where any nation goes. And we got out of all 5 of those. Yeah. We've bailed out of all 5. We got out of media, we got out of education, we got out of entertainment, we got out of government, and we've given up the pulpit. Yeah. We've gotten out of all 5. And so now we're fighting wars we've never had to fight before. Because back at that point in time, I mean, if you'll read speeches of presidents, whether it's Ronald Reagan or Calvin Coolidge or other presidents, they're more evangelical than what I hear in most pulpits today. And that was our civil leaders because we had that common value system. We had a common basis of respect for God, respect for inalienable rights that He gave, limitations on government because God drew the lines about what government could do. But as you lose that cognizance of what God wants, then government thinks it is everything. And it can draw any lines it wants. It can make any rules it wants. It can define any process it wants. And now we're fighting processes we've never had to fight before because we lost control of principle. So it's really been something over the last 50 to 60 years where we've really given it up. But it was God-fearing people who gave it up and said, we refuse to play. We're taking our ball and going home. Somebody else took over the sandbox, and now we're trying to get back in it.
So tell the people a little about what exactly the Center for Self-Governance does. I mean, first off, you teach them about the even concepts, and the language. We talked earlier that there's been a theft of language.
Yes.
And there's a war over language. So talk a little about that, if you will.
Well, we noticed from reading the inaugural addresses of the presidents, starting around the 1870s, that even the president's language started to change. They started using different terminology that the founders were using. George Washington, the sacred fire of liberty, the destiny of the Republican model of government are staked on the experiment and trusted into the hands of the American people. That's one of those principles that you described earlier, is entrusted into the hands of the American people. But the language started changing in the 1870s, we noticed, and you were bringing up how the principles started to be changed. So language is from our experimentation, is huge. Rules, laws are full of language. They're the words, right, that we were told by a former speaker of the Congress that we have to pass it to find out what's in it. What's it full of? It's full of language, full of words, 2,700 pages of language. So from our perspective, we want to teach the average citizen this language of self-governance. So somebody referred to our training program as linguistics training in self-governance. But mainly it's understanding what self-governance is from the perspective of those who gave us this great gift. They defined it as self-determination to control instituted government. You were describing that earlier, David. It's the determination, it's the personal determination to be participants in civil government. Secondly, what is centralized governance? Is this some evil beast? No, it became evil because we abdicated our participation as citizens within the country. Secondly is, what's the distinction between power and governance? There's a huge distinction between the two. I noticed Jefferson wrote to William Jarvis, he said, I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. And so you end up with all the state constitutions, except for California, that say all political power is inherent in the people. So you have this, the founders spoke the same language. They spoke with one voice. It's amazing to me. Ben Franklin had an exchange with a woman right after the Constitutional Convention, where Dr. James McHenry writes in his diary about this woman, Elizabeth Powell. So, doctor, what have you given us, a monarchy or a republic? And it's fascinating, the founder's response is, it's a republic if you can keep it.
That's right.
She had no political rights.
Yeah.
So how is she supposed to keep it? So there's like all this secret, well, not secret, it's just open language, but we just lost the interpretation of what they were saying. Yeah. So we teach our citizens, we teach our students who decide to take our training program. Number one is how to inform the discretion of their fellow citizens. What does that look like? Number two, how to instruct delegated authority. Many of the state constitutions later on in their Article 1s talk about citizens having the right to instruct their representatives. And then finally, what does controlling instituted government look like? Yep. Ezra Taft Benson said that since man was created by God and man created government, then man should remain master over it. What does that look like? We've lost what that looks like. And so our training program spends a lot of time in the first level kind of dealing with the mind-forged manacles that are in the citizens' minds today that have been laid over the last 100+ years.
I got to emphasize, mind-forged manacles.
Talk about it. Let's talk about it.
They're manacles we put on ourselves by our mind.
Yes.
And I'll just give one, because I'm so ticked off over this.
This is so good.
Pastors and churches think they can't talk about political things in the pulpit because of the 501c. That is self-censorship. The IRS has no authority over what goes on in the pulpit of church. We've had a lawsuit sitting out there. We've tried thousands of times to get the IRS to bite on this lawsuit because we keep intentionally crossing the line with pastors where they're saying all sorts of things they're not supposed to. And the IRS knows, like we know, that that is the manacles of the mind, and they want people to self-censor, and that's such a good phrase.
Who's in control of whom? And most citizens don't understand this. It's Ezra Taft Benson's quote, who's in control of whom? Who's the master over the creature? Who's in the relationship between the citizens of this great nation? Who's in control of whom? And we have, I'm talking to myself here, I have put mind-forged manacles on myself up until I was 38, 39, 40, and then until I met my great teammates in the state of Tennessee, and we started asking the questions, well, how do we keep our republic? We don't have to wait for the next elected official to keep the republic. Its republic belongs to Mrs. Powell. It's a republic if you can keep it. So our goal with our training program is to explore together as students, not just, I don't feel like an expert. I feel like someone who wants to join with my fellow citizens in exploring and discussing and in the sandbox, figuring out how to keep the republic.
And I'll jump on that too, because what these guys, what they do at the Center for Self-Governance, it goes back to Proverbs 23:7. It says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And if I'm convinced that, I can't make a difference and I don't know how to do this and I'm an amateur and they won't listen to me, and as long as we're going to keep thinking like that, we're not going to do anything. But if you get a little bit of training, it's dangerous what you can do. I mean, it is really impressive what a person can do when they change their mindset about what they can do and stop limiting themselves. The mind manacles again. You get out of that, and that's where this training is so effective and so good.
Yeah.
There's a tremendous amount of high-five moments when you're going through our training, and you get so excited because what we carry, we don't carry, I don't know, the class is kind of exhausting. We do carry a few people out. Hand in hand, we can now pay our limited experience, because this is such a new program, we can pay it forward, and that is something also biblical. Yeah. If we don't take this and share, shame on us. Yeah. So it's the wonderful storm, and I don't want to call it storm. It's the wonderful rebirth, maybe, of history with modern. Carry it forward with all these citizens that know it's there. They probably didn't even read it. Right. Most of us have not opened any of this. That's right. I certainly hadn't. So for people that think I can't do this, that is where I come in. My job is to be on the phone and say, want to bet? Because guess where I was back in 2010? I was not doing this. Yeah. And it's a choice. but it's a choice that absolutely puts in perspective God damn